to be a part of our Sunday school class. If you're new with us, let me tell you that we're working our way through the Gospel of Matthew. But this class, of course, from its inception, has been dedicated to working through the whole Bible. Every verse, every chapter, every book. And we've made it the second time now all the way to the very middle part of Matthew's Gospel. We'll deal, of course, with Mark and with Luke and with John, and you'll see the differences as we go along, what they say in exactly the same way, and some things that they felt differently about. And they thought something Jesus said or something that he did had a slightly different meaning. Luke thought it meant something different from what Matthew may have thought or Mark may have thought. So we'll try to point those things out to you. Our scholar that we're using for this particular book is Dr. Eugene Boring, who did teach at Phillips Theological Seminary in Enid, Oklahoma, and then was offered a prestigious chair of New Testament studies at Bright Seminary at TCU in Fort Worth. So he's a disciple of Christ, very capable, and has now come virtually to the end of an adult working lifetime and has written his book on Matthew. And that's the way most of the scholars do. They write about one particular book, maybe two out of the 66. And so we're moving author by author, looking for the person who's spent her whole life or his on one of these books. And this is his book. So I am enjoying following along with Dr. Eugene Boring. In dealing with Matthew, remember, his is not the first gospel written. I will remind you about why scholars think it was Mark that was first written. When we get to Mark, we'll spend more time on that. But suffice it to say that Dr. Boring and our other best scholars believe that Matthew had in front of him Mark's gospel. He has in front of him the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, and that he had in front of him another document of teachings that the Germans simply called the source, or the Quella, and so it's sometimes referred to as Q when you're reading in biblical scholarship, the Q document. We're sure there was one because Luke and Matthew copy each other. They copy this document, and sometimes they'll go a whole paragraph, and then they'll differ a little bit. Matthew will say this means so and so, and Luke says something else. But you can tell there's a document that they had that does not seem to have been available to Mark. Mark didn't know about it or chose not to use it in his writing. He doesn't have those teaching materials that are common to Matthew and Luke and so on. The parables primarily. Okay? So I'll try to point these things out as we go along. Let's begin with prayer. God, thank you for these good scholars who spend their adult lifetimes learning as much as they can about one of these books, or maybe two, and that we can move from scholar to scholar and study all 66 of these great books of your all-important book. Bless us as we read and study together. Enlighten us that we may apply these great truths to the living of our lives, both as individuals and collectively as the Boston Avenue United Methodist Church. We pray in Christ's name. Amen. Okay, we're chapter 15, verse 29, right? After Jesus had left that place, he passed along the Sea of Galilee and went up the mountain where he sat down. Now let's just take a quick look here if you haven't looked at one of these maps in a long time. If you'll let this rough map of mine suffice, we're talking about the Mediterranean Sea here. Egypt, of course, is to the south. Over here you have Greece. This would be Athens, and Corinth is over here. Here would be Turkey. This is a part of Turkey. Istanbul is here. You have the Straits of Bosphorus. This is Europe. This is Asia. And over here you have parts of modern-day Turkey, including Ephesus. Gail and I were there again last summer at Ephesus. And then you move on down, and today you have Syria, and you have Israel, you have Jordan, you have Iraq, Iran, and so on. In the part of the Bible that we're dealing with, Jesus' whole lifetime was lived right here in the distance of about 50 miles east and west and about 90 miles north and south. We don't have any record of his going farther than that, about 50 miles from the Mediterranean to the Jordan and about 90 miles from the uppermost part of the freshwater lake that's called by the Bible Sea of Galilee to the Dead Sea down at the bottom, about 90 miles and here about 50. So you can tell mine's not exactly to scale. But here he is at the Sea of Galilee. Now, around this lake, there are some hills. You and I don't think Rockies, don't think Alps. We think hills. They're just little hills that are immediately around the Sea of Galilee or the lake there. Okay, he passed along the Sea of Galilee and went up in the mountain where he sat down. And when it says he sat down, remember that's what rabbis did. Great scholars sat, and students stood and listened. We've held on to this importance of a chair. In Latin, the word for chair is cathedra, and so from that we get the word cathedral. A cathedral, properly understood, Schuller didn't have the right to call his the Crystal Cathedral because there is no bishop sitting there. Cathedral is supposed to mean where a bishop sits. That's traditionally what it is. So, Holy Family is a Roman Catholic cathedral because Bishop Slattery sits there. Now, he has other churches for which he is responsible, but he doesn't sit there, and so they're not called cathedrals. You have Christ the King, but they're all called churches. The cathedral is where the chair is. And in our great colleges and universities, we have chairs. A chair of New Testament studies, a chair of Hebraic studies, a chair of sociology and religion, or whatever. And it's carrying on this old idea that those who know most sit, and those who want to learn come to hear. So when it says he sat down, it means he's the teacher, he's the rabbi. Great crowds came to him, bringing with them the lame, the maimed, the blind, the mute, and many others. They put him at his feet, and he cured them, so that the crowd was amazed when they saw the mute speaking, the maimed whole, the lame walking, and the blind seeing, and they praised the God of Israel. Now, I point this out because the gospel writers never intended Christians to put down Jews, to make life miserable for Jews, and certainly that we were never to think the Jews' covenant with God had been violated. The one who had sent Jesus was the God of Israel. He was the God of Abraham and Isaac, of Rebekah, of Jacob and Joseph, and so on. That same God. And there are references again and again, the God of Israel. They saw in Jesus the workings of the God of Israel, that God, the only true one, was present. Then Jesus called his disciples, and disciples means learners, remember, to him and said, I have compassion for the crowd, because they've been with me now for 3 days and have nothing to eat, and I do not want to send them away hungry, for they might faint on the way. The disciples said to him, Where are we to get enough bread in the desert to feed so great a crowd? And Jesus asked them, How many loaves have you? They said, 7, and a few small fish. And then ordering the crowd to sit down on the ground, he took the 7 loaves and the fish, and after giving thanks, he broke them and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. And all of them ate and were filled, and they took up the broken pieces left over, 7 baskets full. Those who had eaten were 4,000 men, besides women and children. Remember, he's already fed 5,000. After sending away the crowds, he got into the boat and went to the region of Magadan. And here again, we're not sure exactly where that was. In the oldest of manuscripts, and we don't have an original one, of course, of Matthew, but I'm saying in the oldest we have in the great libraries and museums of the world, some say Magdala, from which Mary came, Magdala, and others have Magdalene. So the name of the place where he went has been garbled a little bit. We know there were 10 towns at one time around the Sea of Galilee. They're called in the Bible Decapolis. Deca in Greek, 10. Polis means towns. So the Decapolis, and one of those was Magdala. Capernaum sat right where the 12 would be if this were the face of a clock. And the one that is there now, which is not a biblical town, but was established by the Romans just after the biblical period, is called Tiberias, and it sits right where the 9 would be on the face of this clock. And I've told you it's a sister city to Tulsa, and that mayor has been here. Several different mayors of Tiberias have been here, and several different mayors of Tulsa have gone there. Anyway, one of the little towns around the sea, and the writing varies a little bit from one text to another. Okay, let's see what Dr. Boring has to say about this. Reminiscences of the Markan source remain. And here again, what he means is that we know Matthew has Mark in front of him. And so he's telling a story that Mark tells in his gospel, but Matthew is understanding it a little bit differently, and so he tells it a little bit differently. Matthew has relocated the scene for this feeding to a mountain near the Sea of Galilee. The theological overtones of mountain, remember, Matthew's big emphasis is that Moses was a great man. And today the rabbis in Tulsa would tell you that the clearest revealer of God ever was Moses. And Matthew understood that. That's what the people of Israel believed in biblical times. The greatest revealer of God ever was Moses. And Matthew's intent is to show Moses was a great man. Jesus of Nazareth is greater. And so if Moses went up on the mountain and came down with 10 commandments, then Jesus goes up on the mountain and he teaches and he can feed 4,000. So going up on the mountain is more important to Matthew here than it is to Mark. That's what he's saying. So the theological, again, theological simply means theos, God in Greek. Logia means literally words about. So theology means words about or knowledge about God. The theological overtones of the mountain on which Matthew relocates the scene are of importance. As the conflict gathers and deepens, this scene recalls for the last time the ministry of the Messiah to his people Israel. He's going to start that trek toward Jerusalem right away here. The principal puzzle is why 2 feeding stories with essentially the same structure and meaning, differing only in minor details. Matthew's picture of this feeding is thoroughly Jewish. He mentions the God of Israel, who is praised in Matthew's conclusion, is not a Gentile acclamation, but the language of Israel's own liturgy. You would have heard this in the synagogues as he grew up. Matthew seems to welcome another picture that portrays Jesus acting compassionately for Israel while in conflict with the Jewish leadership. The people of Israel he had great compassion for. The leaders who would finally see to his death in Jerusalem were the ones with whom he had great troubles. He emphasizes the similarities between the 2 feedings rather than their differences. The Messiah of Israel typically, almost stereotypically, that is the Messiah that had been talked about by the prophets. That king of Israel, that descendant of David who finally will get it right, always healed and fed the flock. The location of this Magadan is unknown and has given rise to a number of variations in the tradition. That is, ancient scribes, as one piece of writing material would begin to fail, and it would need to be recopied, they couldn't find Magadan, didn't know where it was, and so gradually they made little changes, a letter here, a letter there, to try to identify it with some place they did know. And I've told you that some of the old manuscripts say Magdala, some Magalan, some Magadan. It's not terribly important. Let's go on to chapter 16. The Pharisees and Sadducees came. Now let me remind you that these 2 groups are not the same. They don't get along with each other. They don't care for each other. There's a Dr. Charlesworth. He is a Methodist who teaches at Princeton. Dr. Charlesworth has spent his whole adult lifetime working on what can we know about that first century of the Common Era, the century in which Jesus lived. And when we had the big convocation here in Tulsa a few years ago of Christians and Jews from various parts of the world and brought in some of the best-known scholars in the Jewish-Christian dialogue, Dr. Charlesworth was one of those who was invited and who came and spoke. And later, it was held up at what is now the Crown Plaza, or was the Adams Mark. He could see the church down the street, looking down Boston Avenue. And when someone introduced me to him as the pastor of the church, oh, could I see that church before I fly back up to Princeton? And so I drove him down here and gave him a tour of Boston Avenue Church and so on. But that gave me an opportunity to get him off by myself where I could talk with him. And so I asked him about these groups within Judaism at Jesus' time. How many were there, and what could he tell me about the Pharisees and the Sadducees and so on? And he said he is convinced that there were at least 17 different groups within Judaism, often fighting each other at the time Jesus was alive. That he can identify 17. The New Testament mentions 4 right away. Pharisees. The Pharisees tended to be more the common folk, who were themselves in some ways rebelling against the leadership in Jerusalem. The leadership in Jerusalem were the Sadducees. The Sadducees were the ruling priestly family, and priests had a lot of power. Those of you who were history majors, as I was, will recall there was a time when Europe was so poor after the Dark Ages and so on. The two areas, I should say, that a young man could rise if he had no family money, no family backing particularly. He could rise in the military, he could rise in the church. You went into the priesthood and you could become somebody if you were capable and so on. You could be moved up. And so the Sadducees were the priests in Jerusalem who really control things. And it was the Sadducees, almost for sure, who really caused Jesus' death, who took him to Pilate and just insisted that he be put to death. The Sadducees were the wealthy, the landed people, and the priests. And they did not believe in a resurrection after death. So eat, drink, and be merry, because tomorrow you die. Accumulate as much as you can, use up as much as you can, tomorrow you'll be dead. The Pharisees believed in resurrection from the dead. They sought out Jesus more and quarreled with him about interpretations. But most scholars believe the Pharisees were sincere in their questioning. They really wanted to know what this fellow thought. And they didn't always agree with him by any means, but they really did seek him out to find out what he thought about various things. Okay, I mentioned also the other groups. We know about the scribes, and the scribes were serious scholars who had studied the Torah in particular, but all of the Hebrew writings, what we would call the Old Testament, and they were very well versed. And so the scribes were more people who just lived with the text. You see, they were not in the ruling party. They were not wealthy people by and large, but they just lived with this text, and they thought about it morning, noon, and night, and so on. The Old Testament we're talking about. And the fourth group that we know about from the Bible were the Zealots. And these were the guys with the little crooked knives, who were very much against the Romans and anything they could do. They were almost the terrorists of their own time, and the Romans tried to terrorize them in return with crucifixion. But the Zealots, if they could get one Roman soldier off by himself, it was a knife in the belly for him and so on. So these Zealots were the ones who fled down to Masada when the Romans were destroying the city of Jerusalem in 70. And were able to hold out up there for almost 4 years, before the Romans could build a sufficient ramp to get them. And when they got up there, they had all committed suicide. So the Zealots, we know about those four groups from the Bible. Dr. Charlesworth says there were at least 13 others. If you want to read some of his writings, you can do that. Okay. The Pharisees and the Sadducees came, and to test Jesus, they asked him to show them a sign from heaven. He answered them, "When it is evening, you say it will be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning it will be stormy today, for the sky is red and threatening. You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times. An evil and adulterous generation." And here adulterous probably doesn't just mean they're sleeping with each other. It means what the prophets meant, that Israel was God's bride, and Israel has not kept faith with God. More likely that, in this case. Doesn't mean they weren't adulterous in their relationships with each other, but more likely that they had slept with foreign gods, so to speak. Usually that's what's intended here. An evil and adulterous generation asked for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of Jonah. And you and I know what that sign is, of course. 3 days in the belly of the whale and then spewed out alive up onto the beach. That's all he tells them. No sign for you except the sign of Jonah. Then he left them and went away. Now when the disciples reached the other side, it means of the lake, of course, they had forgotten to bring any bread. And Jesus said to them, "Watch out and beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees." And here again, you need to remember that yeast generally to Jews was a bad thing. What is purer? Unleavened bread. Unleavened. You and I usually think yeast smells good. Fresh baking bread smells good to us. They think it's contaminating. And when they go into Passover, the really strict observers of Torah, they eat nothing with flour during the Passover days because accidentally, somehow, there might be a little yeast. After we'd pushed our staff so hard here during all of the Lenten season, starting with Ash Wednesday, we kept them going virtually day and night until we got through all the services last Sunday at Easter. So we took Monday off. They didn't get Good Friday and all that sort of thing. So Monday was a day off, and I worked in the yard Monday morning myself and mowed and edged and blew the grass and got the rubble away and all that sort of thing. And finally I'd gone and I was cleaning up and shaving and just flipped on the TV. It's a habit. Gail can tell you, it's a habit. I flipped on the TV in the bathroom while I'm cleaning up. And guess who was on? Martha Stewart. And Martha Stewart was going to prepare cookies with a Jewish child that would be okay for Jewish children to eat during Passover. And what does that mean? No flour. What do you think she made, ladies? Coconut macaroons. Coconut macaroons had no flour. Coconut, sweetened condensed milk, and a little bit of vanilla flavoring and so on, but no flour. Okay. So yeast, you and I tend to think of as a good thing. Makes the bread rise. Smells good to us. To the Jews, it's contaminating. The purest eat unleavened bread. So beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. They said to one another, it's because we brought no bread. He's talking about yeast here. And becoming aware of it, Jesus said, you of little faith, why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not perceive? Do you not remember the 5 loaves for the 5,000 and how many baskets you gathered? Or the 7 loaves for the 4,000 and how many baskets you gathered? How could you fail to perceive that I was not speaking about bread? I'm talking about Pharisees and Sadducees. Then they understood that he had not told them to beware of the yeast of bread, but of the teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Let's go on to Dr. Boring's comments here. The combination of Pharisees and Sadducees is striking, occurring 4 times in this passage alone, and nowhere else in the New Testament except in one other passage in Matthew, back there in chapter 3, which means what? They didn't get along. You rarely see Pharisees and Sadducees talking to each other. They didn't like each other, didn't get along. And so in all of the New Testament, you have 2 passages, both of those are in Matthew, and no other place are these 2 talking to each other. Pharisees and Sadducees were mutually antagonistic groups, hardly likely to be speaking with one voice, as Matthew has it here. Yet, as it is historically unlikely that the aristocratic Jerusalem party would even be up at the Sea of Galilee debating with some itinerant preacher. So that tells you and me what? That Matthew is writing to his community. It's not just about something that happened in the time of Jesus. It's about his community all those years later. Who's going to give you the right direction for living out your own life? Who's giving you the right direction in your community? Because it's very unlikely that these wealthy, powerful people would have trekked 90 miles to ask a question of an itinerant preacher, whom many think might not have been able even to read and write, this Jesus of Nazareth. We can talk about that more some other time. The Pharisees and Sadducees test Jesus, Matthew says, and this is the first use of this word, tempt, since the temptation story in chapter 4, where right after Jesus' baptism, he was tested in the desert, you remember. So Matthew hasn't mentioned it for 11 chapters, and now that same verb is used here. Matthew sees continuity between the devil's opposition to Jesus and that of the Jewish leadership. As the tester was not his friend, not helping him in the desert, these groups are not going to help him either. They're trying to stir up, not trying to come to meaningful answers and discussion. So Matthew sees continuity between these 2. And once again, remember, he's always concerned with the conflict of the kingdoms. The kingdom of the tester of this world, the kingdom of God that's been made flesh for us in Jesus of Nazareth. So Jewish leaders knew how to interpret the sky, but not the only sign that will be given them. The sign of Jonah, which of course becomes the death and resurrection of Jesus. So this has to do with interpreting the times And here again, it's the Greek word kairos. You and I have one word for time, time, but in the Greek they had two. And you always need to pay attention to the use of kairos. The other word was chronos. And there are watches that are called chronologically accurate and so on, chronologically, and it means that it's now 10:10. That's the chronos time. But last Sunday when we talked about it's Easter, this is kairos time. You see, this is kairos, very special time. You and I know these times. Our poets, our playwrights, like Shakespeare talks about, there comes a time in the affairs of men. And if you move at that moment, certain things happen. And if you miss that moment, certain opportunities will never come again. That's what kairos is about, and that's what the word is here. So they look at the sky, and they're fairly good about knowing whether it's going to rain or not going to rain, but they don't understand the kairos, the time in which they live. This lack of ability to interpret the sign has to do with their hardness of heart and their lack of faith. So Jesus leaves the Pharisees and the Sadducees. He will not see them again until the final confrontation, which begins when he gets to Jerusalem and Judea. The disciples rejoined Jesus, who was apparently alone when these two groups came up to him and started asking him these questions. So as Jesus has now broken off communication with the Jewish leaders, here he experiences a temporary breakdown of communication with his own disciples. The disciples are concerned with bread. Jesus is concerned with warning them against the teaching of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The common denominator is yeast. Jesus is aware of their misunderstanding, their little faith. By worrying about literal bread, they're threatening to abandon Jesus' teaching in the Sermon on the Mount and join ranks with the Pharisees, who are on the side of the opposing kingdom, are united with the Satan in testing Jesus. So Jesus calls them to remember the feedings of the 5,000 and the 4,000. And finally, Matthew says they get the point. Okay, let's go on. Chapter 16, verse 13. Now, when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And let me stop a second, because those of you who've been to Israel, a picture should pop into your mind when we say Caesarea Philippi. This little community is north of the lake, the Sea of Galilee. Immediately on the northeastern shore is what you read about in the papers called the Golan Heights. The Golan Heights are the little hills immediately on the north. So if this were the face of a clock, again, it's at the 1 o'clock, the 1 and the 2 position, the Golan Heights. And so you take your bus is the primary way of getting around in Israel for tourists. And so you're on a bus and you go around the lake and then up through the Golan Heights. And you'll see a lot of United Nations vehicles and so on that are patrolling the neutral zone between Israel and Syria. In this case, Syria is just beyond. And you can see Mount Hermon in the distance, and you know that Damascus is up there, even though you can't quite see with your eyes. Anyway, you don't go nearly that far to Mount Hermon or to Damascus, but it's about almost an hour on a bus north of the Sea of Galilee. Now, this bus is not going 70 miles an hour. This is a curvy, windy little road. So it isn't 70 miles north. It's not, I don't know, maybe 20 miles. But it takes about an hour to get there. And finally, the first time we were there in 1983, there was nothing there except these beautiful, clear springs of water. In the last 25 years, 23 years or so, they've added more things. A concession stand and a souvenir shop and so on have gradually been put there because there were enough Christians who wanted to go up to Caesarea Philippi. The snows fall north, particularly in the Mount Hermon range. Mount Hermon is 14,000 feet or something, about like Pikes Peak, I think. And the snows gradually melt all year and go underground, as they do in places in Texas. If those of you have been down to San Marcos and other places, you know how the beautiful clear springs bubble up, and it can be thousands upon thousands of gallons of water every hour and so on. Well, here at Caesarea Philippi, you have such beautiful springs of water. And there are trout this long swimming in the clear, cold water as it bubbles up. Some of the biggest fig trees I've ever seen in my life grow there by this clear, clear water that's bubbling up, this huge springs of water. And those springs begin the Jordan River. And so the Jordan River comes out of those springs down here and creates this freshwater lake. And then flows out the southern end, because the topography is downward, flows out the southern end and comes down here into a contained body, and it stagnates. And so you have a dead sea where nothing lives. So there's minerals, very, very, particularly salt. It's self-saline, very saline. But up here is a really beautiful spot. And in Jesus' time, this was not a Jewish place. This was a Greek place. Okay. Caesarea, we know, is the Latin word for king. Okay. The Germans spelled it a little bit differently and pronounced it a little bit differently and called it Kaiser. Okay. Their kings were called Kaisers, came from this Latin word originally of Caesar. Okay, and the Caesars were the kings of Rome, as you know. So Caesarea is a Roman word. Philippi is a Greek word. And we know that there were Philips. Philip II was the father of Alexander the Great. And so here you have these two names together, Caesarea Philippi, and there are ruins there now of altars to the Greek gods, particularly Pan, the one with the flute, the partying god of the Greeks, and so on. So it was that kind of place. Jesus has gotten them out of the territory of the Pharisees and the Sadducees and all of these who are opposing him. It's sort of an R&R, if you would. It's a time of relaxation. Get out of the crowds of Jewish people who are hearing about him and coming to him. He gets them up to that place. Okay, I think it's important for you to see that as much as you can. He asked his disciples, who do people say that the Son of Man is? Now, this expression, Son of Man, comes out of one of the last, perhaps the last book of the Hebrew Scriptures to be written, the book of Daniel. And it talks a lot about the Son of Man, when the Son of Man comes. And it came to be sort of synonymous with the long-awaited Messiah, this descendant of David. Surely we will finally have a king who gets it right. And by the time Jesus lives, you know, they've been without a king who was the son of David for 600 years. That's a long, long time. 600 years. They're still talking about the Son of Man. So who do people say that the Son of Man is? And they said, some say John the Baptist. Others Elijah. Still others Jeremiah, or one of the prophets. He said to them, who do you say that I am? And Simon Peter answered, and here it's interesting, Peter's a Greek word, and already Matthew's using it. Peter's Aramaic name that Jesus would have used would be Cephas. Simon Peter answered, you are the anointed one. That's what it literally says in Greek, the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And Jesus answered him, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you. That is, no person has told you this, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Petros, and on this Petros, rock in Greek, I will build my church. And the gates of Hades is not hot and fiery. Hades is damp and dark. Sheol is the Hebrew word. The tomb. The gates of death, of dampness, darkness, the tomb will not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Then he sternly ordered the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the anointed one. Okay. All right, this is a very important passage, as you know. Let's see what Dr. Boring says and if I need to add anything. I think he does it really well. Okay, Caesarea Philippi, he says it's about 20 miles as the crow flies north of the Sea of Galilee, had earlier been the site of a Baal, the old Canaanite god, cultic center, but in Hellenistic times became known as Panias, from Pan, because the god Pan had been worshipped in the famous grotto, which is a cave, and spring there, but was renamed by Herod the Great after he built there a temple to Caesar Augustus.
After Herod's death, it was made part of the territory of his son Philip, not Alexander the Great's father, but it's a name that got passed down. And so after Herod's death, his son Philip, that name was added, who enlarged the town and renamed it after Tiberius Caesar and himself. So that's where you got Caesarea Philippi. Now, during the war of 66 to 70, this means in that first century of the Common Era, it's about 36 years or so after the death and resurrection of Jesus, that war that would lead to the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the Second Temple there, Caesarea was a recreational spot for the Roman general Vespasian, who began the siege of Jerusalem and then left his son Titus in charge to complete it when he went back to Rome to become emperor. Now, after the fall of Jerusalem, Titus and his troops returned to Caesarea, where Josephus, that first century historian, reports that he had some of the Jewish captives thrown to wild animals at this place. Matthew's preservation of this location, Luke doesn't call it by name, as we'll find later, may be only incidental, but since he did omit Mark's setting of this conversation on the road, Matthew may have wished to emphasize that the significant scene took place in a setting with other nationalistic and religious associations, both Jewish and pagan. He brings the scene of Jesus' confession, that means confession about him, of Jesus' confession, it has an apostrophe, it's possessive, Jesus' confession as the Jewish Messiah into the very shadow of a Caesar temple, where the Roman destroyers of Jerusalem had celebrated their victory, a revered site long associated with both pagan and Jewish revelatory events. If you want to read the apocalyptic parts of the Bible, the Apocrypha, which is not in our Bible, it is in the Roman Catholic Bible. The book of Enoch tells you more about this. Matthew has Jesus give his own self-identification, calling himself the Son of Man, in his question to the disciples. Jesus' true identity is not new to the disciples, who had heard Jesus refer to himself in Christological. Now, Christological is like theological, except now Christ is at the front of the word. So logia means words about or knowledge about Christ. So he's referred to himself in Christological terms before. They've understood him and have already worshipped him as Son of God, back in chapter 14, as Matthew wrote it. As a result, the scene here is not the Christological breakthrough that it is in Mark. For Mark, it's the first time. It's not the first time in Matthew. So Matthew doesn't see it as important because it's the first time. He sees it as being important because it's done in Gentile pagan territory, and where are his readers having to live out their lives? In Gentile pagan territory. Can you know him as the Messiah, the long-awaited anointed one of God, in pagan, Gentile, hostile territory? That's what Dr. Boring thinks is going on here. The common denominator, let me go on. The emphasis is ecclesiological. Okay, ecclesia was the word for gathering of people, and it eventually came to mean the church, the believers who gather. So we've gone from theological, that is, this is saying something about God, to Christological, saying something about Christ, to ecclesiological, that is, saying something about and to the early church. Matthew's writing to the early church, is what he's getting at here. The emphasis is ecclesiological for Matthew. This confession of faith in Jesus as the messianic representative of God's kingdom separates the new community Matthew is seeking to form from those who oppose and reject it in Matthew, this writer's time. The common denominator of all those named is not only that they are prophets, are you Elijah, are you Jeremiah, etc., but also that they all belong to the transcendent sphere. They've all died a long time before. So John and the other prophets are all dead and must be thought of as resurrected if they're to be identified in any way now with Jesus. Elijah was taken up to heaven without even dying, the Bible says. Jeremiah is added to the Markan list. That is, Mark doesn't have Jeremiah. Matthew adds him. Prophet, though not incorrect, is inadequate for Matthew's Christological understanding. That is, Jesus is far more than prophet. The pronoun you is emphatic here in the Greek, humes, but as for you, Who do you say that I am? It is plural, so it's addressed to all the disciples. Simon Peter answers on behalf of the group. In Mark, the disciples answer simply, the Christ, to which Matthew adds, the Son of the living God. Son of God is a matter of revelation, echoing the heavenly voice at Jesus' baptism. When he was baptized, a voice spoke and said, you are my beloved Son. And so they are reaffirming that that is the case. In this context, the living God contrasts with the idolatrous associations of the locale where this conversation is taking place. Matthew's most important editorial change, remember he's reading Mark and he's following it at times and then he differs at times, and here he's differing. So his editorial change is all that means. He's going to change something from Mark. We've already seen that he has. His most important editorial change is the addition of these words to Jesus' response to Peter about the keys to the kingdom. Their origin continues to be disputed, but the majority of scholars would attribute them to pre-Matthean tradition, coming before Matthew, or to Matthew himself, rather than tracing them all the way back to the historical Jesus. I think that sometime after Jesus' death and resurrection came this idea about having the keys to the kingdom. Jesus' singular blessing of Peter is significant, for in Matthew's gospel, Peter not only represents all the disciples as their spokesperson, and with all of his strengths and weaknesses stands for the typical Christian. They are all supposed to be like him, but he also plays a unique and unrepeatable role in the building of the new community, the church. Peter is not blessed because of a personal attainment or insight that he's achieved. All of this has been given to him straight from God. Knowledge of Jesus' saving role comes by divine revelation. Paul says faith is a gift. Love is a gift. Hope is a gift. These are gifts of God. If you have faith, you don't say, I have taken faith for myself. No, God has made it possible for you to have faith. It's a gift of God. Peter is representative of Christian faith generally. The word for revealed here is apocalypse. It connotes not some personal, individual spiritual experience, but the divine disclosure of the eschatological secret, the end-time secret that God is doing the most significant thing he's ever done in this person, Jesus of Nazareth. There are three images of the role of Peter here. He's the rock on which the church is built. He becomes the holder of the keys. He is the one who binds and looses. The name Peter means stone or rock, as we pointed out. In Aramaic, it's Cepha or Cephas. In Greek, it's Petros. And from this word, we get an English word, petrified, don't we? Something that's turned to rock or stone. It's petrified. There are no documented instances of anyone's ever being named rock in Aramaic or Greek prior to Simon Peter. In the history of these two languages, no person has ever been called the rock, if you would. Thus, English translations should really render the word, I think I'll call you stone or rock. You are rock, and on this rock I will build my church. So Peter is here pictured as the foundation of the church. Although Peter is the foundation, Jesus is the builder of the church. In Jewish tradition, the Jerusalem temple was built on a rock thought to be the center of the world. And today, of course, the mosque that's there is called the Dome of the Rock. And when you look over the little wall inside the Dome of the Rock, you see the outcropping, the very top of Mount Moriah, and they hold that it's the spot where Abraham was willing to offer up, they say, Ishmael, because it's a Muslim mosque. They say Ishmael. Jews think Isaac, of course, was the place where Abraham was willing to offer up his son, if that had been required of him. And so again, the Muslims picked up on the idea, as did the Jews, that this rock is the center of the universe, if you would. It's very important. And on this rock, Jesus will build a church. Okay, let's go on. Church, ecclesia, is found only here and in chapter 18 in the four Gospels. That is, Mark, Luke, and John don't use this word. Etymologically, remember, is trying to figure out where a word came from. Ecclesia means called out. and was used in Hellenistic Greek for the local political assembly. Later it would come to mean the assembly of people of faith. The ecclesia represents the congregation of the God of Israel, Yahweh. This does not mean that Matthew considered the church a replacement for Israel, but a special community of the new covenant within or alongside Israel. Over against their synagogues, Matthew has Jesus place my church. Hades, remember, is the realm of the dead, not the place of punishment. The gates of Hades is a biblical expression that can mean the name, same as the gates of death, if you would. The meaning is that the realm of the dead, which no human being can conquer, is nevertheless not stronger than the church founded on the rock, and the church will always endure to the end of history, accompanied by its Lord. But gates of Hades may also refer to the portals of the underworld from which the powers of the tempter, the Satan, emerge to attack the church, especially in eschatological or end times. Then the meaning would be that the church is under attack by the powers of evil, but will never be vanquished because it is founded on the rock. And the rock is represented in the confession of Cephas. You are the Messiah of God. That's the rock. And Peter represents that statement, that affirmation. That he has said it, and it's absolutely true. In neither case is the church pictured triumphalistically battering down the gates of Hades. The church does not escape from the power of Hades, but participates in the struggle between the two kingdoms with the sure promise that the opposing kingdom, symbolized by the powers of death, will never prevail over the kingdom designated now by the resurrection of Jesus. For Matthew, each of these two kingdoms makes its influence felt by teaching. It must teach, constantly teach. I was talking with a young man just recently about trying to help him make a profession of faith and be baptized, and he said he's very spiritual, but he's not religious and doesn't believe in joining and so on. He's parenting his mother and father. And I said to him, well, let me just tell you something. He's a senior in high school. If everybody had the attitude you have, there would be no book. There would be no church. There would be no synagogue. There would be no temple. If everybody just said, well, I'm religious, but I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. Because religion comes from religare, which means to bind or commit, to bind to and commit. If people do not commit to each other, if somebody wasn't committed to putting money in the plate, it would not be 70 degrees in here right now. It would be near 90 degrees. When it was sleeting and snowing and freezing outside, it would have been 28 in here or whatever. We would not have hymn books. We would not have Bibles. We would not have Sunday school materials. We would not have a choir. We wouldn't have robes. We wouldn't have educated clergy. We wouldn't have any of these things if somebody hadn't made a commitment. If they didn't bind themselves not only to God, but to each other. And yet this is the thing to say now. Well, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. See? Peter's function is not to decide in the afterlife who is admitted and who is denied entrance to heaven. Peter's role as holder of the keys is fulfilled now on earth as chief teacher of the church. Do you understand that? I preached on this one time to you, but it's been a while ago, as I recall. I try not to repeat myself too much. I do write a new sermon every week, but how many different ways can you say faith, hope, and love? You know. So in one of those sermons, though, I was talking about this granting of the keys. People whom you bind and people whom you loose. And what I think that means is, I'm not taking away this from the significance of Peter. He was a very significant person. And we honor him and call him Saint Peter. But every one of us, in one sense, is a keeper of the key. There is somebody who will follow us, as this young man's following his mother and father. He's following his mother and father. and their lackadaisical attitude about things. They don't belong to, not affiliated, not active in any church. I was thinking maybe I could start with the next generation here. He's heard too much for 18 years of his life. See, they had the key, perhaps, to that young man. And I'd talked with him before, and finally I said to him, well, he just, was being a little flippant with me, and I finally said, well, I want you to think about one thing that might make a difference to you someday. 25 years from now, when I'm dead and gone, I want you to remember that the pastor of Boston Avenue Methodist Church believed your relationship with God through Christ was important enough to spend my Saturday night calling you and talking to you. And I said good night and I hung up the phone. Will he ever profess faith? I don't know if he will or not. But if I'm the key, I want to be sure I'm using my key as effectively as I can. I'm trying to teach and to preach and to live our faith. But I believe you are the key to somebody. Maybe a number of somebodies. It may not be your own children. Sometimes our own children don't follow the way we want them to go. Maybe somebody else's child. Somebody else's son or daughter, nephew, niece, or whatever. Who knows? When we impart an encouraging word, but just the fact that you are committed here, that you do provide this wonderful place that is cool in hot weather and warm in cold weather, and that we have materials for everybody who comes, and we're glad to give them a cup of coffee and a donut and all sorts of things, and we set up these visitor centers and do everything we know how to say, we're so glad you've come. We're so glad you've come to Boston Avenue today. We hope you will come again to Boston Avenue. And this week, boy, all these visitors we had on Easter Sunday, I've been calling and say, we're so glad you came to Boston Avenue Methodist Church last Sunday. Thank you so much for coming. And I can look back on the records we have on some of these folks, and they literally, some of them, come Christmas, Easter, Christmas, Easter, Christmas, Easter. I can go back 10, 12 years and show you, I won't, but I could, show you this certain people. They come twice a year. I don't mention that. I don't mention that part. I simply say, we are so glad you came to worship at Boston Avenue Methodist Church. And then I do go on and ask, do you have a church home? Because obviously it isn't ours. And I don't say that part. Obviously it's not ours. Do you have a church home? Well, no. What would it take for you to have a church home? And sometimes I had a guy last night I was talking to last night, and he simply said, well, I need to think about that. And I said, would you be willing to think about it right now? Right now, would you think about what it would take for you to profess faith in Christ and be baptized? I couldn't get him there. This was a different person from the one I was describing before. He said, I'll think about it. And I said, I have plenty of time. You want to think about it now? No, I wouldn't need it. Well, probably isn't going to think about it much. But at least, as the Bible talks about, we put the stone of stumbling in front of him. He's got to think about it. Step over, go around, turn and go back, something. I think that's what this business about the keys really means. Again, not to take away from Peter. I believe he was a very important person in the early church. Very important. But I don't think that takes away your and my responsibility either. We too hold the key for somebody. And all the ways that we help the church teach and the church preach and the church witness to its faith is very important. Well, let's go on here. Let's see. I think we did with all of that we need to do. And just let me do 3 or 4 more sentences. We'll stop. The new community founded by Jesus has insider knowledge that distinguishes it from Israel. Israel has rejected Jesus as the Messiah of God. And Simon Peter has realized the great truth that God was, in fact, revealing himself through his Son, Jesus Christ. Peter saw it, acknowledged it, and for that reason, he is so very important. Okay, just a few reflections here from Dr. Goring. The original meaning of the text is that Jesus builds the church on Peter as the foundation. The text pictures Peter as playing a unique and unrepeatable role in the foundation of the church. For contemporary Christian life, this means that the text can be heard again as the promise of Christ to build his church despite the forces of death arrayed against it. The church should take great heart from this promise. The Matthean, simply meaning this author coming out of his community, the Matthean pattern of revelation, blessing, name-giving, and commissioning found here has already been applied to all the disciples back there in chapter 5. They all are entrusted with the message, the truth they've come to know. God, through Christ, grants the revelation that generates faith. As the one who blesses them, who receives the revelation, the one who gives us a new name, an identity, a nature, as Jacob was made, Jacob was made Israel, so here this one Simon is made the rock, and you and I are claimed and given a new name as a new way, a new life here. And this sends us to continue his work, including the authority to make disciples in his name. Well, we better stop there. We're about to get to the move toward Jerusalem, and you get some of the most important statements about him ever.